down, and there's this nonsense is happening now down here. That's gonna be a problem. God wants me to be sad, which is not inappropriate to say under the circumstances because it is Easter. Anyhow, so I'm gonna get started, sort of officially, in as much as I ever do anything officially. We were playing yesterday Dungeons and Dragons, and Matt brought up an interesting point. He started making fun of me and reading sections of my book out loud in a silly voice. And I started thinking, you know, Matt's right. I'm a pompous asshole. So why have I never done that? I should get online and read my book, right? It's like, what's the point of writing a book if you're not going to rub it in people's faces? You know what I'm saying? I put a lot of work into this damn thing to just have it sit around. So I was thinking to myself, yeah, I'm going to do that. I'm going to get the book out. I'm going to read it out loud, maybe discuss some things that might even help me to better edit it, because it's a trash fire. Obviously, I wrote it. It would be. I'm also going to be able to farm this for clips in order to make the methodology section, right, of the report on the observation of Dungeons and Dragons, because that'll be important too. And I'll have all of this to work with, and I can use this video or parts of this to make a video to pitch the book to people, or to pitch Nostria to people now that we're doing all this shit online. And who knows, maybe somebody will give a shit. That'd be nice. In the introduction, it says, I'd been running a large online game of 4th edition Dungeons & Dragons over Roll20.net for some time. When I heard the first rumors of 5th edition on the horizon. That's true. The randomized 4th edition Dungeon Delve had 50 players, I think, at one point. So I was sort of thinking to myself, well, what would I do if I were in charge of 5th edition? And I started taking a few notes and making a few outlines, which led to brainstorming, section descriptions, which led to pages and pages over several years. And eventually, I wrote this book. It started out as a matter of personal curiosity and became a compulsion. I had inspiration from many other editions of Dungeons & Dragons, used 4th edition as the base because, I mean, why wouldn't you? I assumed that's what people would have done. I included personal preferences and other products from Wizards of the Coast. Good monkeys. Just so delicious. Anyway, I first started in Advanced Dungeons & Dragons. I didn't play it much, though I knew people who did. I was most familiar with D&D as a system, like many others, through the Baldur's Gate games. I went back to AD&D in 2nd edition for inspiration, but AD&D and 2nd edition I thought were interchangeable. That is not the case. It's a lot more complicated than that. I also strive occasionally to add a sense of desperation, danger, and world hostility, which was normal to earlier editions, although that's more of a DM style than part of this system. In fact, using Constitution scores as a bonus for starting HP makes the system less indecently lethal? It's supposed to be incidentally lethal. Incidentally lethal because even with bounded accuracy, the throws on damage at first level are a problem. And they knew that. They knew that going into the game, that it was a problem. And I know that they knew that because the first test module that they put out was Minds of Phandelver. According to my research, mine and Matt's first experience in 5th edition where it was a total party wipe in the first battle, yeah, not unusual. That first adventure is fucking brutal. It's one of those that I might consider trying to do in the Lampédition, or even just to run in 5th edition. I've been thinking about running it in 5th edition on Fantasy Grounds to learn Fantasy Grounds, but I would story the Christ out of it and make it very much more tailor it to my world and stuff, which is the sort of thing that we're doing on Mondays with Descent into Avernus. I implemented a few of the kits, for example. Oh, wow, verbatim. I used them in build options in the classes section. I also strive occasionally to add the sense of desperation, etc., etc. Did I say that twice, or did I just skip the part about build options earlier? Who cares? None of this matters. No one cares about any of this. You will note that there are many different rules I did not specifically describe. This is because I assume people would default to the rules for 4th edition, if not otherwise stated. For the games I've been running lately, I've been having people pool sets of 3d6 and negotiate for the scores rolled in order to form the ability scores in order successively. This is, of course, inspired by these earlier editions. I must note, however, that some credit goes to Matt Koval for this. He did something similar and I added it to my game study projects in sociology. 3rd edition. I played most of my games of Dungeons & Dragons in the 3rd edition and in 3.5. I was the go-to dungeon master for a few social circles for about a decade. Toward the end of that time, I was often dealing with players so familiar with the system that I had long since turned the difficulty up substantially in order to challenge them. That's true. Their strategies were honed and studied. I often treated them as 2 characters 2 levels higher toward the end. That was pretty standard. When 4th was announced, they were highly reluctant to move along with me into the future. I had to make them figure out how to find the enemies to fight them. That's what I started doing. I made it a puzzle to get to the enemies to destroy them, because once they got to them, they just eradicated them. They refused to accept the new version, even when I pointed out how some of the changes were practically identical to our house rules. That's not an exaggeration. It's not. We had actually been doing shit like that. Like the Pathfinder thing of 0-level spells being free forever. We had already been doing that in 3.5, and then they would complain about at-will powers existing in 4th edition. It's the same fucking thing. Whatever. The 3.5 influence on this system can be found in many of the build options. The prestige classes, which aren't officially part of the book, they're still... I've never finished that part, and I may never finish it, unless something about this becomes a reasonable use of my time. Because under the current circumstances, it is not. The Gish and the Swashbuckler base classes were pretty much 3.5 stuff, like I was just saying. The Swashbuckler also, like a rogue subtype, I don't know. I always felt like the Swashbuckler was always getting the short end of the stick. Swashbuckler was such a good idea. It took a lot of the things that people liked about the Duelist and made it base class, which I think was the better way to handle things all around. This approach is not working. Remind me that this is a failure, and I'll do something else, because this camera is going to fuck right off. Not to mention, it was the longest and greatest personal influence and source of my experience. Star Wars Saga Edition took a great deal as well from the Star Wars Saga Edition system. Oh, I've scrolled too far. The Saga Edition system. The notion that there are only a few classes, 20, not exactly few, I guess. But large lists of powers specific to themes. That is very much the case. That left me panting. It left me panting? Meh. Suddenly, I had the freedom to make truly unique characters without having to bend or ignore the rules. I combined that approach to the 4th edition role and power source concept. Now, the power sources each have 4 roles, and each role has 5 build options. Just like the few classes in the Star Wars had large lists, my power source and role interaction classes, I should probably say intersection there for reasons, but yes, I'll change that to intersection. All right, classes have a few lists of features selected in the same way. The camera is not poor, it is an asshole, and it will not work with me. Don't feel sorry for the camera, it's a dick. The 4th edition brought a tactical level to the game, to which I, and only a few others I knew, were familiar and comfortable with, the aforementioned honed and studied players. Others found it, especially in the early days, focused too heavily on that, and not enough on giving us rules for role-playing and adventuring specifically. Although in my experience with the game, that mattered very little, we'd been mostly playing those elements to our own discretion anyway, often disregarding non-combat rules as written in 3rd edition. I just ran 4th edition the same way that I had run 3rd as far as role-playing and adventuring, but instead of disregarding ill-fitting rules, I provided them from the setting, character, narrative, inspirations, etc. Roll20.net helped fill the gaps in the game left by the lack of the online tools for which 4th edition was designed. This allowed me to adopt live battle mapping, custom-designed art for tokens and minis. This was in addition to other innovations, which altogether streamlined the process of Dungeons & Dragons dungeon mastering for me, as well as adding flavor, flair, and the ability for players to have more custom touches and less confusing interaction. Yeah, so a lot of people are all about theater of mind, and I feel like a lot of those people are just sort of like deliberately ignoring the fact that it goes wrong often because they don't like the idea of using battle mats or online stuff or grids or anything like that. Like, they talk like that takes them out of it, but then they argue about which corner they said they were walking around for hours. So I don't know. The system added much to the game. Most, however, felt that it added too much. Yeah, they did a lot of stuff that wasn't necessary. Too much of what was, of what they reluctantly had to learn to take on. The action point system, rituals as compared to spells, monster difficulty categories such as Elite and Solo, and many other things besides. There was a lot of just unnecessary levels of development happening there that new people were not, or that people that had experienced previous editions were not into, while leaving out other things they expected beyond tactics. Rules for paladin players to piss off the rest of us. That is in there verbatim. It is also correct. Sorts of things 5th edition backgrounds added. Flavors and extra rules for the group's prestige classes. Like 4th edition, the Lampédition offers several possible choices at each level for customization and improvement. But now, with a strict division of roles per power source. Where in 4th edition, characters gained powers from a list of possibilities, the list is no longer level-based, but still allows for wide open options. Like 4th, I used the power sources and roles, but limited the number of classes in the base product to fulfill their intersections alone. See, intersections. This is less cumbersome and not strictly necessary, as characters can multi-class, hybrid class, and otherwise grow in power and potential in non-linear ways, something 5th edition doesn't really offer. As such, the role is more of a system of guidelines for the inexperienced or those who would prefer to rely on it, while the power sources allow people to feel different and necessary when varied in a party. So specializations can still matter without having to rely on classes. You just have to know one another as players and one another's characters. Andriel is so mad about 5th edition. It's not that bad. It's just that people have a tendency to presuppose that you're already supposed to know how to play it because it's based on older editions. And I feel like they don't tend to run it so much as expect other people to play it. Which was definitely true of 3.5. Yeah, no, it's trying to escape. Well, now you can't see the Beholder. It's fine. It'll fall the fuck down more and be an asshole. 5th edition. When this project began, 5th edition was a spot on the horizon, so very little of its influences could be found. Eventually, I included a lot of what I thought was useful. Backgrounds and racial archetypes were largely inspired by what information was available on 5th edition from D&D Next, and eventually the 5th edition at large. Much has since been integrated from 5th edition as more materials have been released. However, I was not happy with 5th edition in general, as most people seem to be. I was disappointed to see the return on the predetermined lists of features after 4th and Star Wars had given us so many options. The spell system, too, seemed like a step backwards, into a past that shouldn't have been. I cannot bitch enough about the spell system. The spells and rituals being by level rather than having their own arbitrary and incongruent leveling system was an improvement. 9 levels of spells for 20 levels of character always seemed ridiculous, and going back to it seemed like reactionary madness. That's a reference to a series of books that helped to inspire the original Dungeons & Dragons that no one has read. They're science fiction. They're not even like actual Dungeons & Dragons fantasy. Although, it was Gary Gygax that was probably largely responsible for that, and he did, do the Mind Flayers and their starship at Brokeback Mountain, or whatever the fuck it's called. And the levels are dumb. No, the levels should mesh. I think that they were out of their minds to do it that way. I also feel that the contents of this document allow for a greater number of options and a better quality of character and strategy than what is available in 5th edition. However, it must be said that for getting started quickly, introducing new players, and streamlining certain rules in many cases, not all of them, I make it sound like it's all of them, 5th edition made a lot of things unreasonably complicated, and I don't even understand why. Like, a lot of their choices, I don't think people use those rules, though. I think people hand wave a lot of stuff. 5th does still offer a strong alternative, and I have to admit that. Because I like 5th edition and everything. It's just it wasn't what I was hoping for. And I would choose my system over 5th edition given the chance pretty much all the time. With the possible exception of bringing in certain new people or people that have only experienced 5th edition. Because then trying to teach them my game is a lot harder. But more experienced players. Anyway, this is the part where I start waxing poetic about my own genius. It scales up from here until we reach the apex later. The advantages of this system. The Lampédition system has a lot of particular features which distinguish it. It allows for a greater level of character customization than any other game I've played. Much of this comes from the choices of feats at a regular rate, even numbered class numbers. This is as they appeared in the 3rd edition, 4th, and in Pathfinder. As opposed to those in 5th edition, which are bonkers on purpose, they still offer a certain something that I do kind of like, because of how over the top they are. The features are not level specific, but are selected at a regular rate, with a handful at first level to begin with a fresh feeling character. Spells can be accessed by most power source users at any point they choose and receive a feat. Those who can't have access to special features for making their weapon attacks more dangerous and usable more often. So that this system is in certain ways, balanced is the wrong word because there's so much open field for the choices people can make. There's no way for this game to be balanced. And yet, there's a spirit of fairness in it that I feel like is superior to 5th edition's concept of balance as well. Although, always, the caveat exists of bounded accuracy in 5th edition, which is awesome. And I have nothing like that. Multiclassing also works much more smoothly than in many editions of Dungeons & Dragons. In the 3rd edition, there were experience penalties, which were complex as hell, and I don't think anybody used them. I didn't know anybody that used them because they were fucking... why? Why was any of that necessary? They had a weird idea of how they were going to balance things in 3rd edition. It almost never worked out for them. Don't get me started on 4th edition's multiclassing. Oh my god, I could bitch about that all day. 4th edition multiclassing was garbage. Hybrid classing was supposed to fix that, and it sort of did. It was definitely a better alternative. But the way that we were doing multiclassing to try to make up the difference turned James into a monster. James was unstoppable in 4th edition because we let him be a rogue and a druid at the same time, and it needed to not be that way. God, this beer's good. In 5th edition, the subclasses and the ability score rewards complicate matters. I don't like that you choose between your ability score and a feat. That's rude. In this system, a player forgoes the usual choices for their character level in order to gain access to a new class. This can make it possible for druids to gain animal companions for multiclassing as a ranger without necessarily changing the flavor of their character. A fighter to gain barbarian rage or swashbuckler fighting stances, or many other possible examples. People have talked about making a Witcher, like a Geralt of Rivia type character. It's funny, more people have talked about that in my system than have played my system. There was a party that Adriel was in fact, that was all multi-classed bards. And they were all very effective, different kinds of character. But when you came down to it, they all had a level in bard. That actually got really confusing because it turns out that bard is the most numerically complex class in my version of the game. And it's hard to keep track of all the shit they're doing when you've got like 5 of them. So I don't recommend it, but it's fun, This is in stark contrast to players being penned in even when multi-classing, to someone else's idea of what or who their character should be by the class rules. Now, I've recently had a reversal about this. Not that I disagree with the position now, but seeing it from the other side, I realize why Matt Colville was both a fan of 4th edition and yet maintains this weird idea that the class should decide what you have and that you shouldn't really have choices in the matter, which I thought was anathema. Like, I was all, how can you say both of those things? They seem like they're juxtaposed, right? But it's because when you say rogue, other people know what it means. And I play 5th edition characters. The idea is most people do 3rd level. And the reason for that is that everybody has their archetype by 3rd level. But I never do one class because I want the character to be unique. But I've noticed when I do that with people in one-shots and stuff like that, they don't know how to play with a character like that. Because in their heads, they're like, the rogue, we need to do this with the rogue. The wizard, we need to do this with the wizard. And if your character doesn't fall into those tropes, then they don't understand how to work with you. And that's the reason why Matt Colville is all about the holding on to the stereotypes, so to speak. If you don't, then how are you supposed to work with these people? What are they supposed to do? You have an entire party of people whose characters are totally one of a kind. And that's amazing story-wise, but game-wise, you don't know what the fuck to do with anybody else. You barely understand your own character because you're operating outside of a matrix of intelligibility where you're like, I couldn't do this or this, and they're radically different options. I do agree with Andriel, they are weak, but like, if it's a one-shot, they're not going to have the chance to get to know anybody. The disadvantages of this system. I should be a couple of beers in when I edit my work most of the time. I've always said this. I work better with a little bit of alcohol and a little bit of caffeine. I think that is the answer to my particular form of autism. Because otherwise I'm so distracted by shit that doesn't matter. The difficulties with using this system come from its imbalance and its complication. 4th edition players may stand the best chance of learning this system. This system is made up of modular and detachable parts. This tends to lead to more options that can be reasonably juggled or explored. This system is likely to lack balance. It's not possible with 20 base classes and 5 build options each to keep the system inherently cohesive. Rather, I have sought to fill the game with all the potential that players would require to maximize enjoyment. It is up to the DM and the table to regulate the function of balance. This was largely true in the Star Wars Saga edition as well, which a lot of people still play because it was good. There was a lot of things about it that were good. My philosophy of gameplay. To understand this game system, it will behoove you to understand my philosophy of gameplay. I might order food. The beer is marketing DoorDash directly to my brain through my bloodstream. In which the players build characters that sit at the center of a literary work. What it's supposed to be is that a story is driven by its characters. And this is the single most important thing about creative writing you can learn. And I could go on about that for hours, but we're not going to do that because this isn't a... Chair is not for fat people. Because this isn't that kind of stream. They are the driving force of the narrative, while I often weave the world around them, largely in response to the choices they make. On the face of it, that makes sense, but there's a lot of unpacking that can happen here too. Because when somebody starts talking to me about the kind of story we're going to have, what they don't realize is that that player's character's place in the world is going to revolve around the way we talk about how their character's being made. And what's going to happen in the story is going to be influenced by that. Because the world is the world the character they are imagining came from. A story doesn't exist necessarily in a way where you impose it on players. This is why backgrounds, the most simplistic and less powerful feats, and the variety of features, it allows the players to build characters which are worthy of a spotlight in a myth or hero tale. These stories are interlinking and stitched across decades of my own experience. My world needs them, and they need my world. Giving them the tools to make characters which are close to their imagined heroes, which are as original as possible, hopefully, is imperative. To have many little stereotypes running around is not sufficient. What I mean by this is that there's shit that happened when I was in high school that is a part of this world that people playing the game now that have never met any of the people that were responsible for that are dealing with, because it is consistent within the world there. My design reflects this approach to gameplay. While other games and systems have focused on order for its own sake, I have focused on getting the most return on the investment of creativity. Other systems have largely been written while authors/producers worried about giving players what people assumed they should have or already expect from experience in previous games. while I have focused on giving them what they want and found ways of using that in my playstyle. I work largely by feel and fulfill my own desires for the system. As you will recall, it was always just a daydream. It remains one still. Boy, that's sad, isn't it? This dream I type, it's about expression. This is perhaps too deep. I feel like I'm putting out my own love of the game in a massive epic poem, like a sonnet, but as a structure of rubrics. I ended up performing a series of incidental deconstructions of Dungeons & Dragons, using its parts to construct my own, like a kid with Legos. I have found that sometimes this version of the game better suits experienced dungeon masters who have engaged in such activities, rather than the majority of players. Certainly, it has led to an overwhelming landslide of options in character creation, gameplay, and magic, to the detriment of new players. Furthermore, I have designed the system to open up vast options for the players. This includes the ones who are reluctant to do so. Many have gladly gone back to charts of level-bound features and incoherent spell systems. They troll forums over those combinations which are not cliché enough, which are not min-maxed enough, which are not boring. It's worth noting that the organization of class features listed into build options and the outline of those options running from passive at-will encounter then mode features is meant to combat player choice paralysis. A player can choose a build option for their character and just take the features in order of appearance for the sake of simplicity. The game is meant, however successfully, to facilitate this approach. The action economy. The action economy is how combat works from turn to turn. It can be involved in other things like skills might be used, but generally it's about the flow of combat. In recent editions, actions have been made up of approximately 4 forms. The primary essence of the turn is the standard action. To cast a spell, make a weapon attack, or something similar takes the majority of the turn to accomplish. This was largely the case in Wizards of the Coast system, and is also the case in my own. The minor action of the Lampédition are one of the places where the game really shines. The standard action can be sacrificed for a minor action, as can a move action. Likewise, a minor action can be sacrificed for a move action. In this way, the Lampédition is similar to 4th edition, where the action economy I use has its roots. A character that does nothing else in a round can take 3 move actions. As such, there is no running rule in this system. I have heard many complaints about the bonus action system in 5th edition, some made by Mark Marles himself. In this system, the access to additional minor actions, if a player doesn't move or isn't making an attack, leads to a greater utility of a similar action microeconomy. Minor actions are also used for skill checks in combat, drinking potions, and much of what a bonus action would in 5th edition or Swift in 3.5. The concentration system of 5th edition is amalgamated within this economy, so that concentration is in fact the expulsion of consecutive minor actions on each turn, which must be maintained without failing an endurance check in response to damage or another sufficient distraction. In 5th edition, when you make a melee attack or an attack with a weapon and you miss, your turn is basically over. And it sucked. It was a fucking shitty turn. But in the Lampédition, it's possible for somebody to miss with an attack and then make a skill check and then move, or any number of other things they might be doing, continuing in effect by sustaining it with the minor action that's something that they started in an earlier turn, and using some kind of skill in combat, even after they miss with their attack. The majority of the powers in the Lampédition are passive, at will, or can be used once per short rest. Spells require a long rest to refresh, but tend to be more powerful and rare. The resulting system is not as complex as 4th edition, nor does it lightly abide the 15-minute adventure of 3.5. Characters can rest after each combat and will be very well served if they have spellcasters in the party, but this is easy. One does not learn as much from thusly reduced challenge as they otherwise would. The potential experience is reduced in these circumstances, not prohibiting the behavior, but rewarding it simply more slowly. This is because facing successive combats without rest doubles the possible experience for such a combat. The ubiquitous resting approach itself enhances the probability of success, not to mention reducing the time the combat scenario itself takes. Characters gain additional experience when they forego an extended rest to engage a further encounter. The bonus also affects the next encounter without an extended rest, and on ad infinitum. The ideal performance is probably sleeping after every other or third combat encounter or so, and then being well rested for a major upcoming battle the group is anticipating, in parentheses boss fights. Note that combat is only one of several kinds of encounters, and that there are many sources of experience. Puzzles, trap rooms, skill challenges, and roleplay encounters, while not subject to the bonus directly, can be considered a previous encounter for the purposes of combat experience bonuses. The art persona. Okay, this is the apex. This is the apex of my self-righteousness. The art persona is the creation of a person. This is not something which an individual can do. The art persona requires the Gestalt state of Dungeons & Dragons, or something similar. A world shapes the character. The player shapes the persona. The Dungeon Master works as a bridge, overseer, and supplementer. The rest of the group bounce off the player to inform their own art. The result is the crafting of a daydream, the inspiration given form. That form comes together from parts of the campaign setting, the DM advice and information, the rest of the group, and the interests and drives of the players themselves. The art persona is made solid and useful because of the randomization of the dice rolled in the world in which the characters live, and because of the encoding provided by the rules the group implements. A person is a complex mixture of internalized identity factors and external social ones. The internalizations of a fantasy humanoid that doesn't really exist in reality, or even a humanoid in a world in which they do, is not like those of the real world. The social factors are impossible to understand in their totality in the real world. Those in an imaginary world are also alien. The creation of a person is a deep and meaningful process, or at least it should be. A player then projects their inspiration into the process of making a character. The inspiration takes shape through the implementation of rules as given in the form of choice. What is your race? What is your archetype? What is your background? These things give us the foundations of a person, their homeland, their family, the life ways of their people. It is generally the case that the best results are a reversal of that process, in fact. A player tells me what they think of their character. I tell them which rules will best facilitate that vision. This is before we even discuss classes. Classes should not be a prison of tropes and conformity, but the means of accessing powers to make the character special, to facilitate the art persona. The class provides features chosen by the player for their character, but organized so as to be accessible, interesting, and useful. It finally escaped. It's broken free. The art persona is the goal of the best D&D gamers. There are times when it is inappropriate, however. At times, a quick and dirty, and likely doomed to die in my experience, party is called for. A few one-shots or throwaway games are fun. They need no specific focus on the characters or players. The players use to roll dice, simulate violence, and never revisit. In fact, why would you go through all of what I'm talking about for art persona for a one-shot? That'd be unbelievable. My work has focused on making provisions for the long-term game style of character, what is sometimes referred to as the Big Damn Quest. The Lampédition better facilitates the art persona than other editions, though it may be an ill-advised choice for a quick or introductory game. Characters made in this system have the potential to be totally unique. This project uses 4th edition as a starting point. If something is not addressed here, assume the 4th edition rules are still in effect. If there is no instruction about a minutia in 4th edition to clarify a problem, it's either an oversight or made to be Dungeon Master's discretion. Often it is better for the Dungeon Master to decide what will make for the best story, what will be the best effect for the group they are running, or what they feel will best serve the party, rather than what hard and fast rules should be in place. Often games like Dungeons & Dragons are badly served by people saying this is how it should be because of rules, opinions, or tastes being seen as more important than the flow, feel, and natural direction of the game. This, I cannot stress enough. They fucking say this in the 5th edition rulebook. In the 5th edition rulebooks, they're like, these are guidelines for play, and they like have rules for breaking the rules. Like, they straight up say this stuff, and people are still totally ignorant of the idea that, you know, this needs to be a living thing that you're taking care of. Not something where you say, oh, well, the way that it should be is that great swords should count as reach weapons, and that should be written into the rules because of how I think about squares, or whatever. Pathfinder's shit about diagonal movement needing to be extra spaces. I mean, if it bothers you, and it bothers me, if it bothers you, use hexes, that's what I do. It's a lot easier than saying diagonal movement is movement plus 1/2. This system was designed for online play. I use Roll20.net for almost everything I do. It has a live online battle map. I can use it for games across long distances. The language is used to describe the effects of a game played on a virtual tabletop. This is what 4th did, and all other games did not. That said, I had success with minis on a battle map and theater of mind, though it often invites confusion with the specifics of the rules regarding tactics in the latter case. Oh no, we're all the way to inspiration, shit. This has been the most popular feature I think I have. The inspiration system in the Lampédition is actually based on the action point system in 4th edition. Now, I can probably guess what you're thinking, but stay with me on this. I promise it's good. An inspired person gets to do extra stuff. Quick and easy, get it out of the way. The action points were very similar to Force or Destiny points in the Star Wars Saga edition. The mechanics worked better in 4th, but had a lot of unnecessarily attached baggage. The way milestones and reliant mechanics, as well as Paragon and Epic stuff worked, was hard to get used to. Most would rather not. The result was a hit-or-miss installation of additional mechanics in an already disaffecting system. Spells in the Lampédition are a combination of force powers from the Star Wars Saga edition and 4th edition D&D rituals. They operate, however, on a variation of the 4th edition character tier principle, instead of each having spells operate like the rituals in 4th edition, or the confoundingly illogical approach to spells in other editions, where the spell system's levels and character levels have no discernible relationship. Why would you call them both levels? I hate shit like that. Makes my brain itch. But were instead bizarre and pointless algorithms tolerated purely due to tradition. They're divided into semi-tiers. A tier being 10 levels, a semi-tier is thus 5. All spells are designed to scale to some extent in some way, or provide value to characters of any level. As such, it is not necessary to have a new version of every level or so. Spells are the most effective powers in the game. They allow characters to go well beyond the normal limits of ordinary achievement for a price. That price is that combat spells are fleeting and require an extended rest to replenish. The rituals around 10 minutes to cast. They are obtained by spell training, similarly to force training in the Star Wars Saga. They can be taken by any practitioner of the power source which supplies them, a concept taken from 4th edition. Thus, any character using any power source but martial may take the spell training feat. This reflects the time and focus necessary to channel the energies of the power source into spell. In the Lampédition system, all characters are potentially quasi-magical. Although martial power characters cannot take spell training to gain martial spells, multiclassing is open to any character when it is appropriate to the story. Instead of a paladin having access to a limited version of the cleric spell list, or rangers gaining forest-themed magic after a certain level, the Lampédition allows for players to decide when and what magic they obtain. They may, likewise, choose not to take the spell training feat when leveling up. Perhaps they don't like the feel of most combat spells, want to rely on other powers which they can use more normally, or don't want to rely on extended rests and long rituals. Jeremy Crawford!